Hello and welcome to another episode of the Small Agency Talk Show. I'm your host, Chip Griffin. I'm the founder of Saga, the Small Agency Growth Alliance, and I am happy to have with me today two friends who will add lots of insight to agency leadership and management topics. Ken Jacobs, a returning panelist, and Karl Sakas. This is your first appearance, Karl. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Karl, you never forget your first. So I'll just tell you that.
But Karl has been on some of my podcasts before, so he is not a stranger to interacting with me in these formats, just this particular show. So, and we'll go ahead and we'll jump into the content in just a minute, but I got to run my fancy bumper now because, I spent a whole 10 or 15 minutes creating it, so it would be just terrible if I didn't use it.
Maximize the ROI.
Exactly. And if that's not fancy, I don't know what is, but at least it's got a little energetic, upbeat music to get us moving into the show here. So first, just to table set for folks who have not seen either of you on the show before, if you could just do a brief intro of yourselves. And so we'll start with you, Karl.
Karl Sakas. I run Sakas & Company, where I do consulting, coaching, and training for digital agencies. People typically reach out when they're looking to grow more profitably. I'm based in Raleigh, North Carolina in the U.S., but work with clients all over the world.
And Ken.
Hi, I'm Ken Jacobs. I'm the principal of Jacobs Consulting and Executive Coaching, and I work with primarily PR marketing agencies, helping them to grow their business, manage it for profit, improve client service, and enhance team performance, communications, and leadership. I'm also an executive coach for the senior leaders, owners, CEOs of those agencies.
And both Karl and Ken produce lots of great content in their own right. And at the end of the show, we'll make sure to let you know where you can find all of that because they're creating videos, they're creating articles and other resources for you. So, of course, if you are watching this live, we would welcome any questions or feedback that you have. Just use the chat function on whatever platform you're watching on. If you're watching it in a recorded fashion, go ahead and share your comments, and we would love to go back and read those after the fact as well. So I thought we would get started today by talking about some of the issues that agencies are facing as we're sort of shifting periods, right? So, we are gone from the days of total lockdown. We see what appears to be light at the end of the tunnel. Just a week or so ago, the CDC here in the United States said, if you're vaccinated, you can generally not wear your mask. So a lot of agencies that may still be largely working remote are starting to think about going back. Some, of course, already have gone back to their offices, at least in some partial format, if not fully. But that creates a lot of issues for owners to think about. You need to think about when you're bringing people back full-time. If you are you going to a hybrid model? So let's start talking about some of those issues. And let's start with, should you be bringing people back to the office? If you were fully in your office before the pandemic, should you now be trying to figure out what your plan is to come back? And Ken, we'll start with you on that.
Well, you should be figuring out your plan. That's for sure. I wouldn't automatically assume it should be all hands on deck. I think for a couple of reasons. I think most of the agencies I'm speaking with are starting with some kind of hybrid for a few reasons. One is that some of their folks have really appreciated not having a commute, not spending all that time. So many of them are saying, well, yeah, I want to come back and I want to be with everyone, but maybe 3 or 4 days a week. The other thing is that there are a number of people who have been confused by some of the messaging out there, and they're not sure they're ready to come back. So I would just say being highly empathetic to that and understanding what's going on for your employees is really important. Many may want to come back and, again, all hands on deck. But some of you as small agencies may have 1, 2, or 3 employees who are feeling skittish, and they're not going to raise their hand in this week's group Zoom or Microsoft Team chat to point out, I'm uncomfortable, right? When I see Chip and Karl and Ginny and Shanali are all comfortable, I may not raise my hand. But, if they're uncomfortable, we've got to figure that out. If they're uncomfortable, they're not thinking about the work. They're not focused. They're not thinking about PR and marketing. They're not thinking about clients. They're thinking about, should I be here? So I do think this is a time for empathetic leadership around this.
Yeah, and I think there are two big things that you said in there that are important takeaways. The first is you should have a plan, right? Whatever your plan is, you should have one. Don't just sort of wake up each morning and say, well, this is what we're doing today. This is a period of time where you really need to be thoughtful about what you're doing, because it affects yourself, it affects your team, it affects your clients, and so you need to have some sort of plan of action going forward. And the second thing is the importance of communication with your team about what their concerns are. And particularly, I really want to emphasize what you said about some folks aren't comfortable raising things in team meetings. And it's one of the things that I harp on a lot is the importance of one-on-one between every manager and employee. And so if you're the owner, whoever your direct reports are and whoever their direct reports are, everyone needs weekly one-on-one meetings, because that's an opportunity for folks to safely raise those concerns, amongst many other benefits of those meetings.
Just one more point.
Yes.
The other, you've got to give your folks time for their planning. If you look at a lot of the young people who, and I'll just use something local, left Manhattan, left Brooklyn, left whatever, went back and been living with mom and dad in the suburbs, in this case, Connecticut, Westchester, New Jersey. They need time to either sublease or get rid of their sublease or move back in and all that. So that takes a little planning time. So, we would add that in as well.
Right, and I want to come back to that if we have time, because I think it's important for agency owners to understand the implications of having their workers moving to other places, because I think that's something that a lot of agency owners aren't really conscious of, and they probably could get away with it a little bit last year, but I think that the regulatory authorities are going to be taking a closer look at that in the months and years ahead. But Karl, so as you're talking with agencies, are you seeing a lot of them having plans? If so, what direction are they headed in, and what other things should they be thinking about?
There's not a single right answer, right? This is going to be unique to each agency, the owner or owners and team members. Certainly, there is that trend toward hybrid. I have some clients who've gone 100% virtual. Usually, that was where that's something they wanted to do pre-pandemic. And now this was the opportunity to make it happen. I generally don't see people expanding their physical office space. And if someone is trying to weigh, what's right for them, consider it's a mix of what do you want as the owner, and you also want your team to be on board with it. So I would start by looking at what is the gap between what you want and what your team wants. You are the dictator of your agency, but if you want to do something and your team doesn't, you're going to face the consequences.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and we've seen already some blowback for some employers not in the agency space who have taken that hardcore, you're coming back on this date and it's going to be fully in person and just deal with it. And that's not a really good way to do it. You really, even if that is your ultimate plan, you need to work with your team so that they can plan and adjust to it, and you can figure out, are there situations that you need to accommodate for? Similarly, if you want to go all remote, you need to think about those things too. And I think, a lot of folks, when thinking about going remote, they worry about parents with kids, but it's also a lot of the younger workers, whether they've decided to move in with mom and dad or they've got roommates. They may not have ideal work from home scenarios that, if you're going to stay fully remote, you need to start thinking about, right? People could sort of get by in a corner of the dining room, for the last year, and people made a lot of allowances for things. But I think that if you're going to go fully remote, you need to be thoughtful about those issues too.
When the pandemic started, all of my client work is with agencies, but I run a CMO group through a marketing association. One of the CMOs had just downsized. She was empty nester, kids were out of the house. She and her husband had downsized to a smaller place. And then the pandemic started, and all 5 of their adult kids came back, along with dogs and romantic partners and so on. So I think at one point they had like 7 people working in the smaller house, plus the dogs, everyone trying to get work done, that not an easy situation. Thankfully, everyone has headed back out again by now.
Yeah. The thing I'd add to the thinking is that, we're not going back to March of 2020, right? The world has changed, and for a very long time, that we've found new ways to work, and many agency owners treated their staffs as the mature professionals that they are, and they understood that it's not about the volume of hours and the output. It's about achieving client deliverables, right? Making change in the marketplace, being able to prove it. And it's not, did you work a 7 or 9 or 12-hour day, but did you focus on the priorities and did you meet your KPIs? So I think a lot of employees in the agency business have been thriving on this autonomy. And so you really have to think about, do you want to go back to, we have to all be together because we always have all been together. They've had this autonomy. As I said earlier, some have benefited from not commuting if they were commuters before, whether they use that time for professional development or self-care or exercise or an extra hour of sleep. People have benefited from that. Do you really want them to give that up at least 5 days a week? So I think it's going to be much more together 3 to 4 days a week. But I think people want to hold on to, from the ones I'm speaking with, the employees want to hold on to 1 or 2 days a week at home and get the benefit from it as long as they're performing it. And many of them feel they've proven it.
Right. And I certainly do think that, most employees that I talk to, whether in the agency space or otherwise, have appreciated a lot of the additional freedoms that they get. So regardless of whether they're inclined to go back to an office full or part-time, they still want some of the freedoms and flexibility that have come about over the last year. But I think one of the challenges for leaders, for managers, is figuring out how to, if they've been accustomed to managing fully in-office personnel, to now, they patchworked it together how to manage the team over the last year or so. But if we're going to that permanently, either fully remote or a hybrid model, there are some challenges from a management perspective over how you do it well. And I think the hybrid, which is the one that's most likely to kick in for a lot of businesses, is probably the most difficult to figure out how to balance, particularly if you have employees who may be more remote than not, and another segment that's maybe more in office than not because it works better for them. So Karl, as you're counseling agency owners and leaders, how do you counsel them to work through some of those management challenges?
I would start by recognizing that managing remotely, managing virtually is harder than managing in person, right? But it's worth it. Right? It gives you more options for your team. It gives you more flexibility for your life as an agency owner. A key thing is that if you're pursuing a hybrid approach, I would recommend thinking of it from a virtual first perspective. That is, anytime you have a meeting, even if people are in person, there still needs to be some sort of a virtual component. You don't want a situation where, someone has to, meet with the cable company and they were going to be in person, but they weren't, and you weren't ready to go, right? That's having the video set up, having the streaming set up, and things like that, so that your virtual employees, whether permanently virtual or they're virtual that day, don't feel like second-class citizens. I noticed that in past agencies as an agency employee, PM, Director of Client Services, Director of Operations, both agencies had people working remotely well before that was a, sort of a standard thing. And they weren't highly integrated, right? It was sort of an afterthought. Like the meeting would start and it's like, oh, wait, we need to conference in so-and-so, right. Or it's like, they can't make it. How do we, someone send them the link, and what's the link? I don't know. So, ultimately, if you can think about being virtual first, even if you're operating on a hybrid basis, that's going to make life easier for you and for everyone on your team.
Yeah, and I think those mixed interactions are one of the biggest challenges. And it's something, I haven't been fully in office in 20-some years. Everything I've done over the last 20-some years has been either fully remote or some hybrid model. And I can tell you that as someone who has been on both ends of the I'm in the office and we have some remote and vice versa, it is a very strange dynamic. It's gotten better as conference rooms now typically have a video component, or people are requiring that folks do meetings from their desks so that everybody sort of is in a similar dynamic as far as being on Zoom or whatever. But it's there's still a big difference when you have half of the team in each place for the same meeting or interaction, and that I think is probably one of the toughest things to overcome.
Yeah. Well, just to go back to a few things you just said, it's been 15 months. If you're still patchworking it, like, come on, guy, come on, dude. You got it may not be perfect, but hopefully you have figured out how to make this work already, is thought one. And thought two is, use the time well. When you're in the office, use it for collaboration, creativity, and reconnection. Let's have those drive-by discussions, those flybys. Let's have that time by the coffee machine or whatever it may be, as long as we can do it safely, and encourage people to think about when they do what they do. If you've got independent work, independent writing, independent editing, to the fact that you can, to the degree that you can, do that when you're working from home, and really use that. Really think through, when we have everyone here or half the staff here, if you can accommodate everyone, let's really use that as, again, creativity, collaboration, reconnection. So it takes some thinking to get it right. And and that way you have more independent work when you're independent. If I can add another thought, as an energy coach, I know energy is contagious. Everything is contagious. So if a leader is trusting their people, I trust you. I trust you to know the work. I trust you to do it. I trust you to be committed to 5-star clients. If you extend that kind of trust, people will act in a trustworthy manner. They'll use the time well and professionally. And, people say, I don't know, I have a few that, if I'm not there watching them, it's like, no. They were never trustworthy when you were all together. They were never trustworthy through the laptop. You've got a bigger issue. And you have your core team of people who have always been autonomous and independent. And, you could trust them while you were sitting together. You can trust them on the days they're working from home. That's about the caliber and character of the people on your team, I believe.
Right. If you can only trust them when you're micromanaging them and looking over their shoulder, you're not really trusting them in the first place.
Exactly.
But Karl, one of the things we were talking about before we came on air was the potential for turnover in agencies in the months ahead, and there's a variety of different reasons for it. But some of the things we've just talked about are also things that may contribute to it, right? So if I make a decision as an agency owner on a new work model and it doesn't sit well with my employees, that could spur some more. So why don't you talk about some of the factors that you think may potentially lead to some agency turnover in the months ahead, and how agency leaders should be thinking about that?
I would start by doing an employee or team census. This is something I do with every new client engagement. That is, list every team member, list, what's their title, their compensation, when did they start, things like that. And then look at things from a few factors. For instance, how's their morale on a scale of 0 to 10? What is their openness to change on a scale of 0 to 10? I think of, as you evaluate employees, there's a continuum of new rope. Those are your strong, reliable, highly productive business building employees. New rope, then you got wet twine, not as great, often causing drama, things like that. There's some people in the middle. But ultimately, create that employee census to evaluate what's the team you've got. To echo Ken, the employees that you were worried about before the pandemic, there's a reason you were concerned about them. Years ago, a client had an employee who was so unproductive, they put the guy's desk outside the agency president's office so the president could look out the door and see, was he working? But thankfully for that employee, he had gotten a new job before they hired me as a consultant, so I would have recommended firing him. If you've got employees you're concerned about, focus on that rather than, whether it's virtual or not. Thinking about turnover, there have been various articles about people sheltering in job, amidst the pandemic. Maybe they were thinking of leaving. I had a date recently with a woman who apparently had thought of breaking up like a year earlier, but then the pandemic started, so she decided not to. There were a lot of things going on there, but take a look at your team members. Who seems to be engaged, who's not. Don't do like what the WeWork CEO said, and he said through the Wall Street Journal, you can tell how engaged an employee is by how much they want to come back to the office. Conflict of interest much there. But look at each.
But you wouldn't expect the CEO of WeWork to be encouraging remote work, would you? I mean, that would be.
Yeah.
Actually, they could be a beneficiary, right? Because a lot of people who may be working for a remote organization may still need a place to go, and so I think places like WeWork could actually be beneficiaries of this new model.
Some of my clients are exploring that, where maybe the agency is primarily virtual, but maybe they have certain city-based clusters where some people get together sometimes, whether it's through Desk Pass or similar options. You need to go with what's right for you. Do keep in mind that if you're leaning toward everyone must be in the office, which I'd say is not the norm across the agencies I work with, you're limiting your options. You're eventually going to get an ultimatum from one of your team members if you're like, must be in the office. They're like, I've always wanted to move back home to be closer to my parents for free childcare, or I've always wanted to live at the beach, or I've always wanted to live in the mountains, or I've always wanted to do this or that. I'd like to keep working for you, the employee might say. Is that an option? Mm-hmm. And if your answer is an automatic no, because you're like, you must be here, are they an employee you're willing to lose? Sometimes they are, but imagine, thought experiment. If your best employee said to you, hey, I love working here, but I need to move for XYZ reason. Can I work remotely? What would you say? And I mean, indeed, Chip, your note about getting into some compliance issues, I'm not a lawyer, but my general view is if you've got employees who are in other states or other provinces, you need to be registered there and you need to be filing the paperwork, and it's a huge hassle. But one, it's the right thing to do, and two, all kinds of penalties if you go around it.
Right, and I think you've made a great point there that your automatic answer shouldn't be no if someone comes to you with that. At the same time, it shouldn't be automatically yes for that compliance reason. You want to make sure you at least understand, because it does. I mean, obviously it varies with other countries, but here in the U.S. it varies from state to state. So some states you do need to register if you've got an employee there. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you just need to register from an employer perspective, but you don't need to register the whole business. You need to be working with your professional advisors, not folks like us, lawyers, accountants, people who actually are qualified to give you opinions on that and understand those, because you could get into some challenges if you don't.
I'm just curious.
I filed to hire a team member in New York State, and was waiting for things to show up and this and that. And finally, I called. It appeared they hadn't processed things, and they're like, we've currently got a 2-month backlog.
Right.
Whoa.
Yeah, and New York is one of the fun states to deal with on stuff like this, I can say from experience. Yeah. So that is certainly a state where you want to register. You don't want to just skate by. But go ahead, Ken.
I'm just curious, the person you were dating and talking about hanging out for a year, was she referring to her place of employ, the previous date, or you? We really want to know, like, when she was saying, no. Okay, no. But something... I have heard that SHRM, the Society for HR Management, is predicting a turnover tsunami once the pandemic ends. Now, I don't know how we officially declare the pandemic over, but a lot of people didn't want to be last hired, first fired, so people were just hanging out and hopefully doing their jobs. But if this predicted turnover tsunami, and I think it's well named, is going to happen, all leaders have to think about what kind of leadership style will help me keep as many of my great people as possible. And I think those who are more of command and control, dictatorial, forcing people to come back to the office or forcing anything, I think they're going to be at greatest risk for that tsunami. So I encourage all agency owners and leaders to think about if this is coming, and I think Sherm can be believed, what's our best defense against that?
Right, and I think there's a lot of things that you need to be thinking about in that regard, and one of them is one of the concerns that's been raised by some of the employers who have said, I want everybody in the office full time, is the tension that's created when you've got a mixed workforce. And in particular, there are folks who believe that the people who are in the office are more likely to advance. They'll get preferential treatment because they are closer, both physically and then because of the relationship that you develop in person, closer emotionally or whatever to the actual managers. And so, Karl, as you look at that, is that something that your clients are concerned about? Is it something that they should be thinking about? And if so, how do you make sure that your remote employees don't feel like second-class citizens?
Well, it's by making an active effort to include people, asking how people are doing rather than just asking, in the physical meeting room and not asking about the virtual employees who are joining remotely. In general, I think the more you can do to up-level your leadership and management skills, the better. I share about that in my book, Made to Lead. It's a pocket guide to managing marketing and creative teams. One of the tips was decide if you're the kind of manager who rewards FaceTime or results. If you choose to, and this was, I wrote this in 2016, well pre-pandemic. But I noted if you're a FaceTime boss, you're like insisting on people in person, embrace it and accept that you're going to attract and retain probably lower quality employees. Mm-hmm. So up-leveling your leadership in general will pay all kinds of dividends.
Mm-hmm. Now, Ken, this is obviously something you've worked with a lot of leaders on over the years, even pre-pandemic. But how do you, and you can obviously take some of these steps to proactively integrate your remote team, but isn't there an element of just the nature of that human interaction where you're getting a coffee together or doing things that, one of the things that over the last 12 months or 18 months we've seen most folks struggle with is how to socially integrate remote team members, right? People have tried virtual happy hours and those kinds of things, but I don't know about you guys, but I haven't seen a lot that really replicates that same casual interaction. And as much as you may try to block it out, can you? So I guess, Ken, that's my question. How do you make sure that you're overcoming that, or right. Can you?
Well, I think, if you're in touch with your team and you're asking and you're really listening, you're not immediately going to the answer, but you're truly listening to what they're saying and asking another question and then asking another question. You can really figure out what's going on for them. And, maybe for some of them, they're in the office a little bit. It's just that they don't want the 5 days a week. So I think we're going to have more of that interaction. I think that'll be there. And that's, what you use it for. So put that into place, encourage people to participate, find out what their fears are, and see if you can alleviate them. I think Karl's idea of the survey is just so spot on for the times, because then you'll know where people stand. I think for me, it's leadership always trumps management, and I'm not negating management. But if you are starting as a leader, some of the things we've talked about today, empathy, listening, sensing energy, figuring out what drives your people and figuring out their values, if you do those things, I believe you can manage through anything. The people who have managed through this pandemic, who have created an opportunity mindset, who have pivoted their businesses, who have pivoted their services, who have pivoted what industries they serve, all of that, to me, comes from being a great leader. And if you're really doing leadership development, if you get a leadership coach, if you're reading the right books, if that's where you start, I think managing through everything is so much easier, because it's the proverbial, you look around in the rowboat and you see people who want to be there with you and want to help you make it work. So I always say, lead first, the rest will follow.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Karen Swim, a regular panelist on this show, chimes in that too many confuse leadership and management. Leadership does not require a position. And regardless of whether it's leadership or management, agency owners are going to have a lot of that to do in the months and years ahead because things are changing and will continue to change. And I really appreciate the perspectives that both of you have offered. If folks want to learn more about you and how you can help them on leadership and management issues, Ken, where can they find you?
I'm going to spell it Ken at JACOBSCOMM.com. JACOBSCOMM as in Mary.com. I'm on Twitter. I'm at Ken's Views. I'm on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm findable.
You are everywhere, Ken. And Karl, where should folks go to learn more about you and your services?
Yeah, you can learn more and get access to hundreds of free articles and more at sakasandcompany.com. That's SAKAS, the word company.com.
And of course, you can find out more about me at small-agency-growth.com. I appreciate everybody who has taken the time to watch today. Hopefully, we've given you some things to think about as you make plans for the next steps in your agency's development as we all come out of this I don't know, challenging time, whatever we want to call it, whatever overused phrase we want to employ. But we're not going to overuse any more phrases because we are at the end of the time we have together today. It is Friday, though. Hopefully you can all have a great weekend. It's good weather in lots of parts of the country this weekend, from what I understand. So get out there, get some fresh air, and we look forward to seeing you back here next Friday for another episode of the Small Agency Talk Show.